After my college graduation, the threat of my impending student loan repayment plan was enough to push me into the first respectable job I could grab. I'm sure a lot of you can relate. My degree in English was a great excuse to apply for anything and everything I could. I mean, what exactly is an English degree good for? It translates well, I told myself. Everyone likes good communication skills, at least. This led me to interview for a local non-profit agency where I had interned once over the summer in high school. They had an opening for a position that I thought I could manage fairly well in. The job entailed visiting elderly or disabled clients and screening them for public benefits like food stamps or Medicaid. They offered me the job as a benefits enrollment specialist, and I accepted. My duties seemed pretty straightforward, although I clearly needed continuing education. As a 22-year-old at the time, I didn't understand how closely my job hedged on the often sticky world of social work. Most of the clients and families I met with were simply in need of more wiggle room in their tight Social Security funded budgets, but on occasion, there were some truly horrific cases. I'm going to tell you about the visit that made me quit my job. It was late November of 2015, and I was settling into my tiny, windowless office with a Starbucks latte around 8 a.m. As was my ritual, I flipped on my desk lamp in lieu of the blinding fluorescent ceiling light and punched in my voicemail code to pull messages off my phone while my computer booted up. The first two calls were from an intake worker at Job and Family Services and the director at Catholic Charities. I scribbled down their information on a sticky note and waited for the third message. I frowned when the recording started, straining to hear. Can't, said a faint voice on the other line. It sounded like a woman, but I couldn't hear a name over the static in the background. I could also hear something or someone else making what I could only describe as a moaning noise, painful and strangled. Was it a cat? The person's TV? I stabbed the one button to replay the message, taking down the caller's phone number listed in the automated recording beforehand. The message was left at 2:07 a.m. It took a moment to pull up the database where we record all of our clients' contact information and call notes. The program runs slowly, as our records date back to the early 2000s. Punching in the phone number brought up two profiles. One for a woman in her 80s on Bidden Road named Mary. The other for a man with only his name, Edmund, and the phone number field populated. Mary had called just once before, looking for a local food pantry. I found it odd that no other information for Edmund was recorded, but I let it go. I certainly wasn't the first in this position, meaning more than one person had, at some point, entered calls in the database. Perhaps the benefits enrollment specialist before me had forgotten to finish his file. Before I allowed myself the time to think it through, I found myself on the road with Mary's address punched into my GPS system. I should have been more concerned about that strange voicemail, but my low visit numbers this month had me determined to go see Mary. If I didn't hit my numbers, our government grant was affected. I literally couldn't afford to ignore this. A 20-minute drive past the pleasant side streets of my Pennsylvania town eventually led me to a less traveled intersection. Overgrown foliage flanked either side of the narrow road, seeming to converge on my car the further I drove. Moss-covered trees stretched their dying branches overhead, creating a menacing effect that left me slightly uneasy. Mary's home was situated at the end of Bidden, quite alone, where the pavement simply tapered off into a grassy dead end, weeds consuming the crumbling chunks of asphalt where it had cracked. The front porch was missing several balusters, and the front door sat warped in its frame. I pulled my car up to the side of the house where the scanty patch of dried grass told me visitors had parked before. The steps creaked loudly, and there was no doorbell. I rapped 3 times on the door with my left hand. My right hand was shoved in the pocket of my jacket, gripped tightly around a tiny can of mace I always carried with me. I waited for several seconds before calling out, "Hello? Mary?" There was no answer. "Mary?" I called again. This time, I could see movement from a faded lace curtain strung across a window to my left. I hesitated for only a second before turning the knob on the front door and opening it with more authority than I felt. "Mary, this is Stacy with Blank Services." Nothing. "I'm coming in now," I continued, stepping into a dusty living room. The TV was on, set to a staticky channel showing the Price is Tight. I felt relief at this point, knowing that someone was home and I wasn't wasting my time. If not Mary, perhaps a son or daughter that I could speak with about her call. What immediately caught my attention was the state of her home. The carpet beneath my feet was stained with something dark, animal feces most likely, and there was a strong odor as though a rodent had died inside the walls. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, although I could see signs of recent activity. A newspaper folded haphazardly on a flimsy TV tray, and a water ring on its corner where a glass had sat not long ago. My eyes swept the room again and took in the dust particles swirling through the air. A moldy, half-eaten sandwich of some sort sat on a paper plate next to a threadbare checkered armchair. Ew. I saw some troubling signs that Mary may have Alzheimer's or dementia. A crossword puzzle in the newspaper had been filled in with words that didn't fit, and there was a pair of mismatched slippers near the armchair. I lifted my gaze to the ceiling and sighed. Water damage had warped the wood in some places, and mold was visible in the far corner. I took out a small pad of paper and started scribbling down some notes. In home care, home weatherization, it was clear that I had my work cut out for me. I moved further into the room when another strange scent hit my nose. I could hear a bubbling noise as well and stepped quietly into a small and likewise filthy kitchen. A large pot sat on top of a gas stove, frothy juice spilling out from under its lid. Steam rose in billowing clouds and made the small room stifling. I turned around, wanting to find whoever was home and advise them to check on their food, when a small form in the corner caught my attention. I gasped, dropping my notepad. There was a woman sitting at the formica-topped table. How I missed her, I'm not sure. She looked very old with matted gray hair and long, broken and chipped fingernails. Her face was dirty and creased with age, and her eyes looked as though cataracts had taken most of her sight. Despite this, she was staring straight at me, with a somewhat vague smile on her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there," I said, gaining my composure. "Join me for dinner," she said. She spoke softly, and as she did so, her right hand clutched a second chair, which she slid slowly away from the table. One of the many unspoken rules of my position is to never accept food from a client. I smiled and picked up my notepad, then walked over to the chair she had indicated for me to sit in. The closer I got, the more it smelled as though the woman hadn't bathed in several weeks. "Are you Mary?" I asked, trying to gain my bearings and redirect the conversation. My heart beat rapidly in my chest after being so startled. She nodded slowly and smiled even wider, revealing only 4 teeth that I could count, all of which were brown and looked in danger of falling out. "Join me for dinner," she said again. She stood up from her seat and hobbled over to the actively bubbling pot. Whatever she was making splashed and sizzled onto the burner. "Do you live here by yourself?" I asked while she stirred the contents of the pot with a long wooden spoon. Again, Mary nodded. While she worked, I jotted down a few more notes, then peered up at the dirty framed windows hung crookedly on the walls. Most of them seemed to be of pets. 2 dogs sat obediently on either side of a younger Mary. There was a horse in one frame, and next to that, a photo of a man in a flannel shirt with his arm around Mary's shoulders. The body language looked as though the two were family. Something clicked in my brain. "Mary, do you have a brother?" I asked, my eyes still glued to the photo. "Is this Edmund?" I turned my head back to Mary, only to find her inches from my face with her mouth turned down into a frown. How she moved that quickly, I have no idea. Her bony, arthritic hand snatched the photo off the wall, and she dropped it to the floor. "No," she said. The frame lay at my feet, its glass shattered on the linoleum. Mary turned back to the stove and poked her spoon back into the pot. No way in hell was I staying for dinner. While her back was turned away from me, I slid the faded picture from underneath the broken glass and tucked it inside my jacket. I quickly assessed my situation at this point. Mary lived alone, and she clearly shouldn't. She displayed some violent tendencies, but I felt safe enough to stay for a moment more to gather a few more facts. As I scribbled down some more points about this visit, Mary set a bowl down in front of me. "Eat," she whispered. I lifted my eyes to the bowl, the stench overwhelming, and my stomach heaved. I lunged away from the table, nearly falling over, and fumbled in my pocket for my cell phone. "Oh my God," I breathed, hurrying to the door. "Eat!" I heard her scream from the kitchen. I wrenched open the door and tripped down the steps to my car. Out in the cool, clean air, I stabbed 911 into my phone and tried to gain my composure. I locked myself in the car while I waited for the police to arrive. Mary, it seemed, had decided to stay inside. 2 cruisers and an ambulance came wailing up the road some minutes later, and only then did I feel my heart rate start to slow. Both men cautiously approached the home and entered with their guns drawn. Mary was escorted out and handcuffed shortly after, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her filmy eyes rolled in all directions, and her hair flew in her face as a chilly wind kicked up. Leaves swirled across the lawn, almost in protest of Mary's removal from the home. 3 more cruisers arrived while Mary was being restrained in the ambulance. They started taping off the area around the house. One was speaking into his walkie-talkie, another taking photos of the outside of the house. I called my supervisor. An officer in his mid-50s draped a blanket over my shoulders when I hung up and asked me to recount what happened. I told him as much as I could spit out. Mary lived alone. She likely has Alzheimer's. She used to have a brother. "Where is he now?" the officer asked. I shook my head. "Ma'am?" I took the photo from inside my coat and handed it to him. "I think he's in the pot." Hello to anyone listening. If you've been here before, you may have noticed I sound different here. I was recently in a car accident and had to get emergency surgery on my jaw. I haven't been able to read or upload because of it, and as you can tell, I'm definitely still struggling. I am improving a lot with each passing day though, so I'm hoping to keep doing what I enjoy and create more creepy content. So thank you for bearing with me. It's going to take me some time, but I'll be uploading again soon, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to the incredible authors that allow me to narrate their stories. This author's links will be in the description. Feel free to send me your own scary story at the email on the screen. And until next time, sleep tight.